Hello, my name is Jim Collier. I'm an investigative reporter, and this is an open letter to Frank Hughes. Frank Hughes is the man in charge of astronaut training at Johnson Space Center in Houston. He trains the astronauts now, and Frank, you trained them back in 1969 through 72 in the Apollo mission, so you were the expert that I got when I called NASA and spoke to Audrey Schwartz in the press department and said, I need an expert to answer some questions, and you've been very kind in answering. But here is the entire problem, or as much as I can get into this 2-hour tape. What happened was, a man named Ralph Renee came to me several years ago with a manuscript for a book called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. And he was a physicist who had studied, a self-styled physicist, I guess the press will call him after this, but he knows his physics really well. And I was incredulous, like most people, that we didn't go to the moon. And I started investigating him. And then I found out that he got his information, or a lot of it, from a man named Bill Kaysing, who worked for Rocketdyne as a man who wrote scientific papers for the scientists, and he had a gray pass, which meant he could go anywhere and see anything. And he saw a lot of propulsion experiments, etc., and he wrote a book called We Never Went to the Moon. Astronaut James Lovell of Apollo 13 called Kaysing a wacko for claiming we never went to the moon. Kaysing, who's been investigating NASA for 20 years, is suing Lovell for libel. The trial takes place October 7th in Santa Cruz, California. Kaysing analyzed NASA photos and came to the conclusion they were all taken on Earth. The results have been printed in media around the world. Notice the upper right-hand corner of this photo. It was supposed to have been taken on the moon, yet the ceiling beams are clearly evident. Here's a close-up of those beams. In January 1997, London-based Fortean Times printed an analysis of NASA's film footage by award-winning British cinematographer David Percy. Percy came to the same conclusion as Bill Kaysing. All the photos were faked. Both based their conclusions on shadows running in the wrong direction or running in two directions at once, indicating spotlights were used. The sun also appears to be originating from a spotlight, as there is a halo around it. There can be no halo where there is no atmosphere. Percy is doing a BBC documentary on all this, and it will appear in London and around the world sometime this year. He's an award-winning cinematographer who is writing a book called Whistleblowers, and it should be out in 1997. This famous shot is in almost every NASA book. You can see in the faceplate that the astronaut taking the photo of this astronaut has no camera, and the camera is shooting down on the head of the astronaut, making the camera at least 8 feet high. That's impossible. They were both on level ground in front of the spaceship. This famous shot is filled with anomalies, including tracks on the moon's surface. You can see the antenna on top of the crosshair, and the crosshair is etched into the camera. Couldn't be there. And just above this crosshair, the picture is airbrushed out. This famous rock has a Roman numeral C on it. Could not happen. And it also appears to be sculpted or paper mache'd. How can you have a round rock where there's no atmosphere, wind, rain, to round that rock? So I went to investigate the LEM, that strange contraption that supposedly landed them on the moon. It never flew on Earth. Frank, it never flew on Earth. So I said, well, who invented this thing? I went to Grumman Aircraft. And they're in Bethpage, Long Island, and I said, give me all the material that showed how this was developed. What thought went into it? And so when it crashed on Earth and never flew once, I said to myself,
Why would the astronauts' wives let them go to the moon and test it out there? I mean, you'd have to be wacko to do that. And a funny thing happened, Frank. They told me all the paperwork had been destroyed, that all they had was some PR pieces, a couple of photos, you know, not even photos, they had drawings. And I found that incredible. You spent $30 billion to go to the moon, and all the paperwork's been flushed down the toilet. So I went to the archives in Washington, and I went to the archives at NASA, and I went to you. There's no paperwork. The man who invented the LEM should have won the Nobel Prize. His paperwork on what made him think this would work should be in every museum that NASA has, but it's nowhere. And so the taxpayers spent $30 billion, Frank, on what half the world thinks is a hoax.
This is the lunar module falling freely toward the moon.
Jim, it was a little rush, but we got it done. Right here, 5-9, Jim, and we're sailing free. 1, stand by 1, Jim. Okay. You look just as pretty in Earth light as you do in sunlight. Roger, America. Have a good burn. You're loud and clear.
Frank, let's start with this book by Jeffrey Kluger. It was on the Apollo 13 adventure, and Kluger worked with astronaut James Lovell and with NASA, and so I assume everything in here is as accurate as that investigative reporter could be. All right, Frank, this is the LEM, and this should have looked like a rocket. You can see how it's back here. It's lopsided. And these jets, this one, they're on the top. The theory being that when these jets fired, this is the rocket that held this thing up. When these fired, it should have tipped it over immediately. I want to know the scientific principle, the aerodynamic principle that would have kept this contraption from tipping as soon as these top rockets fired, because we see it later. You'll see going along the moon's surface, and it's going horizontal to the ground. In other words, these were making it move. But if it's floating on this, 10,000 pounds of thrust right here, and these shoot off, what scientific principle would keep this thing from tipping down and turning and spinning and crashing to the ground?
This simulator, the LEM, flew once on Earth, and it blew up, almost killing Neil Armstrong, who bailed out. The LEM never flew on Earth.
You know, Frank, one of the most important parts of this investigation was whether they could get in and out of the LEM. And it says in this book by Jeffrey Kluger is that an overlooked fact of the lunar module design was that the door opened inward toward them instead of out, which made it almost impossible for them to get out. It says here that the size inside the LEM where the two astronauts were was barely the size of 2 phone booths. And I measured that. It was 24 inches by 36 inches, and I don't believe they could have gotten out, but we'll see.
We're at Space Center, Houston. I have a meeting here with Frank Hughes. Frank Hughes is the chief in charge of astronaut training. He was the only man who claims who's left from the Apollo missions, and anything Frank Hughes says should probably be considered gospel.
This is a simulator of the crew cabin in the LEM.
This is not a wall here.
I know, but he couldn't get his backpack
past the bars that are here. So even though it went back, you couldn't back up because there were metal bars across here. So he could not back straight in.
I don't know about bars.
Well, you see him up there.
There's enough room that you could turn around. You know, you could put it on, you could get yourself situated. Your buddy helped you get it on and get it running.
Now, did they?
You had to fold these things up. Remember, this is what I'm talking about, the folding up of the controllers.
Right.
Okay.
But the panel sticks out here about 8 inches.
Yeah.
So it takes up. Can I measure that?
Sure.
It takes up about, if that's 36 inches from the front to the back, it takes up about 8 of those inches.
But you have plenty more inches here.
Yeah, but you can't back up into that, right? That's my problem. I mean, they may be there, but
You can back up. That's what I'm saying.
130 Houston, we're deploying and we'll go.
all right, you have about 24 inches from here to the front of this panel. Now, when they come from the command module into the LEM, they have to come through this tunnel and drop this hatch. And this space from here across is also only about 32 inches at best. It's slightly less wide than the front door. All right. Here's where this is half the section. One man stands here. His feet are rooted to these. This holds him from floating down here, these sections. You'll see it in the video. This is half the door, about 18 inches. And from the front to the back is about 32 inches, because when the doors open, the door hits the bulkhead in the back. This right here keeps them from backing up into this bell area with their backpacks on. They stow their equipment up here. So it's hard to back up. And here, this curve is equal with the floor right here. So they can't get into this section at all. And you'll see that there's wires and wires and tubes here keeping them from, they have to watch where their feet go. So it's so tight in there that 2 men in full suit with backpack cannot move. I misspoke. The door is actually 16 inches wide. Here, half the door. It goes 32 inches to the bulkhead in the back. And you can see on the sides that it's filled with instrumentation, and you can see the bell here goes up 18 inches. And they were laboring under the suitcase-sized backpacks that they would have to wear on the moon, and that they had to crawl out on their hands and knees, and that they had to waddle. They were so puffed up, ballooned up is the words. They're in their backpacks, ballooned up in their suits. Here it is here, balloon-like suits, laboring under their backpacks, that they had to waddle in there, Frank. In other words, they couldn't bend their legs. They couldn't bend over in the middle, under 4.5 pounds of pressure per square inch in their suits. And so there's a real question as to whether they could get out of that LEM or not. And according to this book, it was an idea overlooked by Grumman. Seems to me that should have been the first thing you did, Frank, that NASA did when they went to Grumman to build this, was say, hey, these astronauts need a certain amount of room to get out of there. But that didn't happen. This book, U.S. Space Gear, is in all NASA museums. One can pick it up and study the history of the space suit used in the Apollo missions. The problem with the suit from the very beginning was that they were basically inflated rubber balls. The astronauts could not bend their arms or legs and fingers in there. This is an early attempt at a pressurized suit, and here you can see a man in a pressure chamber testing out the suit, and you can see those ballooned up arms. That was the problem that NASA had to solve before they could go to the moon. And here was an attempt at using convoluted plastic suits to try to